A lot has been written by Dr. Murray and Rothbard. If you had to recommend one thing for people to read, what would it be? And what is the lesson from this book or essay from Murray Rothbard that you'd like to communicate to as many people as we could?
Sure. So there's a lot. Yeah, man. I mean, there's a lot of. I've heard a lot of different people who recommend this book first or this book first or whatever. Maybe I'm biased because this is how I did it. But so I found Ron Paul during the Giuliani moment, which was in 2007. Then I got obsessed with like Googling him and looking him up, and I found Tom Woods and Peter Schiff. And so I started reading all of their books and watching all of their videos and just like obsessing over it. And it was probably like at least a year or two till I started reading Rothbard. I just had heard Tom Woods mention Rothbard so many times as like he's the guy that eventually I was like, I gotta read this Murray Rothbard guy. And I heard Tom Woods, I think, I'm trying to remember back, I think it was that Tom Woods said to read these two essays. I can't remember if that's right. But the first two essays that I ever read, pamphlets, essays, something, the first two ones I ever read were Anatomy of the State and War, Peace, and the State. And those are the two that I recommend to start with, because it's just like, to me, when I read those two, it was like, it was game over. Like I was really interested in this thing and had been interested in this thing for a while. But once I read those two essays, now it was like, there's no going back. Like I'm here now. And Anatomy of the State is just like, I truly understood the nature of the state after reading that. And War, Peace, and the State, I truly understood the nature of war after that. And nothing can. It's almost like one of these things that once you learn it, you can't unlearn it. And so that's what I would recommend to people. But there are other things that other people recommend more. Rothbard has like some economic, like technical writing that he's done that I've also enjoyed. I mean, I read Man, Economy, and State, and I did get a lot out of that. And I know that like economists will be like, that's the one you got to read. But man, there's some Murray Rothbard writing that just punches you in the stomach. Like I remember reading his stuff once I started getting obsessed with him. Or you start like reading this stuff, and I'd be reading it alone in my studio apartment in Brooklyn, New York, where I was living at like 3 a.m. because I'm a weird person, and I was just like doing stand-up comedy and then coming home to read Rothbard essays that I had printed out because I couldn't like afford books and shit. But I remember just like reading stuff and putting it down and almost like looking around this apartment with no one in it, like as if I was looking at someone else, but like, yo, dude, did you hear what he just said? But like the "Do you hate the state" piece, egalitarianism as a revolt against nature, left, right, and the prospects for liberty, just like all of these pieces were just so powerful. So just like if you're really interested in these ideas, you read that stuff and you're just like, yo, I'm never going to look at anything the same after this.
So if you had to give the audience the bullet points for Anatomy in the State and War, Peace, in the State, what would those bullet points be?
Okay, so bullet points for Anatomy of the State would be basically it's like, what is the state is the question, right? And so you'd say what is the state? What is the state? For the example, what is the federal government in Washington, D.C.? And he would say like, okay, well, it's not the people. It's not just like everybody is the government. The government is us. That's ridiculous. If you believe that, then you'd have to believe that 6 million Jews committed suicide in Nazi Germany, right? If they are the government, right? So clearly some people are, or that, black people enslaved themselves in the late 17, early 1800s, or I guess all 17 and early 1800s. So that's obviously not the case. The government isn't like the hills and the land. The government isn't your uncle and everyone you love. It's not America. That's not what the government is. And so what is the government? And the government is a small group of people, a concentrated group of people who have the legal authority to initiate violence against the entire population. And they're essentially a gang that completely won. And he kind of goes through that it's like, if imagine a gang moved in and tried to take over a block. Well, now imagine they were more successful and they took over a neighborhood. Well, now imagine they were more successful and they took over a country. What would it look like? The government. That's what it would look like. They are the state. And there's a lot more to that. He gets into like the role of intellectuals and the idea of the state constraining itself and all of that. But I think that's essentially the argument. And then in War, Peace, and the State, basically the argument is like, okay, if someone aggressed against you, then you have a legitimate moral right to recoup that aggression or something like that. So if person A violates the rights of person B, then they have a right to go see about person A, or recoup what they did. But if person C, who had nothing to do with anything, is just their rights are violated in that process, then obviously that's completely wrong because they had nothing to do with that. And that war, by the very nature of war, it means innocent people being destroyed over something they had nothing to do with. And he breaks it down so much more brilliantly than that. But to me, that's like kind of the essence of it, that you go, there's kind of no case where it's ever justified to just destroy the lives of people who didn't do anything. So no matter what Saddam Hussein did, this isn't in the essay, but this is just me extrapolating from it. No matter what Saddam Hussein did, you have no right to just incinerate Iraqi children over that, because they didn't do anything to anybody. And so that's essentially, I think, the crux of the argument.
What do you think is the greatest intellectual contribution of Rothbard's student, Hans Hermann Hoppe?
I think his greatest, a lot of people will point to, Democracy, the God That Failed, which is his most popular book, and a lot of the kind of moving libertarianism into a culturally rightist direction. And I think there's a lot of value in a lot of that stuff. But to me, his biggest intellectual contribution, and by the way, A Theory of Capitalism and Socialism is just a phenomenal book. Phenomenal book. No matter how much you've read about like socialism versus capitalism, if you haven't read that book, you're like, it's got some whole new angles and new insights that you have to check out. But to me, Argumentation Ethics is that's the one. And okay, so for people who don't know what Argumentation Ethics is, I've talked about it several times on the show, but basically it's okay, so in the same way that Mises kind of like would make his line of argumentation, and Rothbard also did this in several of his works. He does this thing where he basically starts with like an a priori truth and then logically deduces things step by step from that. And anyway, I don't want to get like too like heady for anyone. If you don't know what the terms mean, it's not like that complicated. An a priori truth just means like something you can logically deduce, like something that you don't get from empirical evidence. You just get from thinking about it and realizing that that's true. And so something like an a priori truth would be that two objects cannot occupy the same space at the same time, right? So that's an a priori truth. We can all understand that and just know it's true. We don't have to go start testing it out. Like, you don't have to go around and be like, let me see if I can just force two objects together in the same space. And they were, well, it didn't work that time, didn't work that. We can logically understand that this is never going to work, right? And so Mises starts his great piece, Human Action, by the a priori truth that human beings act with intention for certain outcomes. And what Hoppe does is he starts Argumentation Ethics out with people argue. And basically where he goes from that is he has this beautiful like string of logical arguments that if you argue at all, if you argue and you're not a libertarian, you're contradicting yourself at some point. And so basically what it is that, and look, I'll say this, there are people who have tried to poke holes in the logic of this, and maybe they have successfully. I know Bob Murphy has had some things to say about this, and so I'm not even arguing that this is a perfect proof. If I'm being completely honest, it's some of when people get into the arguments about whether he was completely right or wrong about this, it stretches me to the limits of my intellectual capacity. Like, sometimes when you feel that, you ever listen to like an astrophysicist talk about something really deep and you're like, I'm almost ready to tap out. Like, I think this might just be too much. I was listening to not an astrophysicist, but just a physicist talking about like subatomic particles recently. You want to really have your mind blown? Listen to some of that. Like, this is crazy, Keith. I'll get back to Hoppe in a second, I promise. But have you seen? Okay, so this is a thing that's real, that's completely accepted amongst physicists, that subatomic particles move differently when they're being observed versus when they're not being observed. Did you know that? Have you heard that before?
I am not familiar with that thesis or how it can be falsified, but that is interesting.
No. Okay, so this is what's crazy, is that they have a whole way of falsifying it, is that they can watch how subatomic particles move and kind of track how they're moving, and then they can measure that they move different when they're being observed versus when they're not being observed. And now, that blows my fucking mind and is insane, but when I'm listening to a physicist explain how they know that, I'm like, this has stretched me to, I'm at my limit. I am not smart enough to understand this. Okay. So anyway, so I'm not claiming that argumentation ethics is a perfect proof, but there is something so beautiful about the idea that I'm like, no, there's really something to this. And basically what it is he goes, okay, look, human beings argue. And once you argue with someone, like any type of argument, a political argument, it could be any other type of argument. But as soon as you're arguing with someone and you're trying to win the argument, there are things that you are implicitly accepting when you do that. And number one, what you're accepting is that you prefer nonviolence to violence. You prefer to persuade this person than to just like force them. Because if you preferred violence, you wouldn't argue with them. You would just try to beat them over the head and force them to accept your point of view. And then, okay, there's other things you're accepting when you're arguing. You're accepting that I own my argument, and like I own my mind and you own your mind. Because I'm presenting an argument from my mind, and I'm trying to persuade your mind. And then from that, and there's all these steps that he goes through, and and that it's like, look, what we're all accepting when we do this is that we prefer peace and norms that allow for conflict resolution rather than all-out war. And then if you realize that I own myself and you own yourself, and you realize that we prefer to not have conflict versus having conflict, well then who should have control over you? I mean, if you have control over you, there's no conflict. But if someone else has control over you that you don't like, then there's a conflict there. And so we already agreed that we prefer not to have this conflict over having this conflict. And okay, now also we're going to need property in order to live. In order to live, we're going to have some, if there's scarce means, if there's scarce resources, and there could be a conflict over who gets these resources, well, we've already agreed that we prefer a peaceful resolution to this over a violent resolution to this. So then there'd have to be some type of property rights where things are assigned to one person and not to another person. And that's the best way to resolve a conflict. And okay, how do we do that? What's the most just way to do that? And he takes it all the way through to be like this perfect libertarian argument where like once you start arguing with someone, you're almost conceding so much of what libertarians believe in. And I just think it's the most brilliant thing I've ever heard in my life. And then I would say, so that's number one. And then like a close number two is that I think Hoppe woke a lot of libertarians up to the idea that there's this natural tendency that a lot of libertarians have that is like, hey, we believe in the non-aggression principle, and therefore, if someone's not, initiating violence against a peaceful person, we shouldn't have anything to say about what they do. And Hans Hermann Hoppe did a lot to really to say, no, in fact, we can have lots of opinions about what that person's doing. And in fact, in a private property based society, in a true private law free society, the property owner gets to dictate what the rules are. And those rules in many cases might be much harsher than what we have under government control. And you can see this, particularly today, I think this lesson is so valuable, where you're like, oh, if somebody almost has this kind of juvenile interpretation of what libertarianism is, which you see a lot of times when I talk to, I was just talking to Dinesh D'Souza the other day, and I talked to some of these kind of more right-wing guys, and you can see where they'll go, yeah, well, libertarians say this, and you're like, no, that's not what we're saying at all. Where it's like, look, let's just say a lot of libertarians have this idea that it's like, hey, if you're not doing anything, that violates the non-aggression principle, you can do whatever you want to do, which is like, okay, kind of, that's kind of true. But let me ask you this, what's more loosey-goosey, the streets of San Francisco or my house? You know what I mean? Like on the streets of San Francisco, some homeless guy can just be shooting up heroin. But in my house, if you try to do that, I will shoot you. Right? So actually, libertarianism can be a thing where it's actually much stricter and much more like, no, you're not going to do that thing, even though you could technically say that's not violating the non-aggression principle or something like that. It's like, yeah, well, on my property it is. And Hans Hermann Hoppe has done a better job than anyone of smacking libertarians in the face with that reality.